Welcome to Sex Talk with Natasha, everybody. I'm so glad to be with you tonight. We've got a really important topic to cover, which is going to be kind of how do we survive rape culture? I mean, that's really kind of what we're going to be talking about. And I'm really glad to have this topic on with a guest. Before we get on that, you'll notice that Ashley tonight is missing. So bear with me as far as technical issues. Hopefully this is on Patreon. Hopefully it's on YouTube Live, and hopefully it's on Facebook Live. So hopefully everything is put together. She is dealing with some illness issues, so that's never fun. And I'm trying to go solo tonight, so bear with us on that. Just as far as Sex Talk with Natasha goes, I think some of you may be already kind of understand kind of the flow of things. We start off with kind of a general idea of the topic, and then we welcome the guests to ask questions and kind of give us their background a little bit on what they're experiencing more on a personal level, so that hopefully it can become more applicable. The information that I have is more applicable to you. I love giving this program, and I'm just also going to be very upfront that it's not a currently sustainable program financially. So I have somewhere usually around 60 to 70 subscribers. And to make this a financially viable project, I really need to up that number to about 500. We will be having this program be a consistent show for almost a year now. So we started really last December. So I'm excited to kind of be getting close to our anniversary, but I just want to let people know that if you value this, if this is something that you really enjoy seeing, whether it's that you want to support me or support the program or support other people who maybe can't afford subscriptions to the program, but that still benefit from the free aspects of it, then those are all really good reasons to become a subscriber. Not to mention all of the perks you get as a subscriber at different levels. And you can go on to sextalkwithnatasha.com to figure out what all of those differences are and at what level you might be interested in subscribing. Sex Talk with Natasha in general is a comprehensive, sex positive, sexual education forum where I try to offer good education, good aspects. I'm a certified sex therapist. I have been for, gosh, almost 7 years, I think now. And so this topic is near and dear to my heart. I am a big believer that most of us have some type of sexual healing to figure out in our lives, because I just think we come from all different walks of life, but I don't know many walks of life that don't have some level of sex negativity attached to it, as far as how we were raised, how we were taught about sexuality. We still have so many myths and misperceptions abound, even amongst mental health professionals. So I think it's just a really hard thing for people to get good information on. So, so that's what I'm trying to do here. And if you like it, if you find this valuable, please consider supporting us. I will be looking at comments and questions, although again tonight that's a little bit questionable because Ashley's not with us, so I'm probably not going to be as good at that. But typically we want to hear from you as the program progresses, so that we can answer some of your questions along the way or at the end. So if you want to know more about me or want to see me professionally, you can always go to my website, natashaparker.org. Symmetry Solutions is my practice. Symmetry Souls, SOLS.com. Those are all ways that you can contact me directly. Also, as a subscriber, you can contact me through email or through the page. So there's all different kinds of ways to get in touch with me if you need more information. All right, so we're going to be talking about rape culture. And Diamond, do you mind if I just, before I even get started, if I just include you a little bit as far as just, can you give us a little bit of your history or what brings you to the program? What types of experiences have you had that brings this topic to mind? If you don't mind starting there, and then I'm going to kind of give my...
No, I don't mind at all. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Mainly, I actually, before this started, I thought, should I count the number of, either rapes or rapish type things that have happened to me? Because I feel like just the sheer constantness of it in my life, of it being one person or another that was crossing the boundaries. For me, it's been a lifetime battle of figuring out how do I draw boundaries for myself in this culture where it's a constant fight, where in my life, for instance, I don't know what other people's lives have been like. Mine was very, uh, my dad left when I was like 8 years old. So we were very much chaotic in a lot of ways. So I was very, I think, in a dangerous situation, just from
The vulnerability.
predators knowing that my mom had to work, I was home alone, I think. And, so I just don't know why they came out of the woodwork, but they did. And so for me, that's been my big thing, is figuring out in this culture, how do you stay safe? How do you why wasn't I safe? That's not quite as big of a question anymore, but doesn't matter so much anymore, other than the fact that parents should know that their children are in more danger, I think, than a lot of them think they are, and and I look how old I am. And so this was back when everybody thought their kids were safe. I was out riding my bike by myself, even at nighttime. Nobody felt their children were at risk. So now I can imagine it's probably even worse. I'm very protective of my kids. But so, for me, it's just learning how to traverse this culture that I feel like on some days I feel like we've come so far, and then other days I feel like we're going in reverse, and it's frustrating because, as a woman, we want to be able to be safe, and yet we want to be able to be, like, sexual too, as adults. Right. And I don't think it's easy to find the balance, and I don't think it's easy to draw the boundaries and still feel like, especially for women, like we're still nice people being nice, when I have this one pop store I go to that eventually my kids keep saying, every time I run into some guy who is being inappropriate, and my kids are like, Mom, just stop going there. And I'm thinking, well, I think I can navigate this, and so just navigating it to me is the hardest part.
Okay.
If that answered your question.
Thank you. And I'm glad I asked you that because, well, I know you a little bit, Diamond. I've met you a few times during certain kind of activities that we've been involved with through advocacy work. But so I know a little bit about your story. And so that's why I wanted you to share some of that, because I think something that you've mentioned that is so prevalent is how much we're seeped into this in our culture. This is not, I think that a huge part of the reason of the thing that I want to get across today is that what is rape culture? And that's very different from the actual, assault that we call rape, and I think a lot of times people get off put by that language. Like, it's almost offensive. Like, we're not part of rape culture. Rape sounds really, really bad. Only really, really bad people do that. That only happens in dark alleyways with strangers. And so I can't be a part of that. And I don't want to take any responsibility for that. And I think that a huge part of what we're needing to do in our society is own the many ways that we conceptualize rape and sexual violence and sexual assault, and the many ways that we handle those things when they happen, and the messages and scripts that kind of tend to abound. And that's something that we are all a part of. It's not that you need to be a perpetrator or a really, really bad person to participate kind of in rape culture. And that's why this is such an important thing, I think, for us to be discussing. So I'm just going to talk just a little bit about what is rape culture. So this is a term that was coined back kind of the 1970s and that kind of feminist first wave movement to show ways in which society blames victims of sexual assault and normalizes male sexual violence and aggression. Okay, so so some very common things that you might hear. One is the trivializing of male sexuality and male aggression. Boys will be boys. locker room talk, you know, these kinds of things that we hear right now, 2018. This is not like 1950s. This is an issue we have right now. This is how we talk about men. We assume men have higher sexual drive. We assume that men should be sexual aggressors. We assume a lot about male sexuality that hurts both men and women, but in particular, it really hurts when there is any type of sexual assault or aggression. The other one that's very common is blaming the victim. So she asked for it. You know, she was the one that was in some way or fashion responsible for what ended up happening to her. And this tends to come from the reality that most of us don't like not having control over a situation. So therefore, when we look at something that's bad, we want to say, that couldn't happen to me. It must have been something she did that then I can protect myself or my daughter or my children. And if I stay away from that, whether it's the way I dress or the way that the places I go or things like that, then I'm not going to be part of that risk. And that is very dangerous because none of that correlates into statistics. And then, and on top of it, for victims, it's re-traumatizing and very, very harmful. So what I want to be very clear is that this whole idea of rape culture includes everything from like sexual remarks, jokes, you know, verbal things, to sexual touch or anything that has to do with groping or touching or anything like that, to, you know, the full-blown penis and vagina, penis and anus rape. And just so I say it, at least, you know, this, you might need a trigger warning for some of the things that we'll be talking about tonight. So just to kind of put that out there. So, so it's a spectrum. It's not just this one act of sexual violence. Sexual violence can come in lots of shapes and forms. And in these particular ways, especially with sexual remarks or what would be called, you know, maybe a grope or something like that, we tend to very much minimize in our culture through this stuff of boys will be boys, and it's very, very harmful. So you see, so in a sense, it's this assumption that sexual violence is kind of a normal, inevitable part of life, which has been your experience. Mm-hmm. Right? It's been an inevitable. People sometimes think, well, rape is super uncommon. Only a few people are raped. And if they're raped, that's probably a one-time event that happened in their life that was really horrific. The reality is that actually rape victims, due to vulnerability issues that you talked about, oftentimes have multiple accounts of very serious sexual assault. And I don't know if I could find any woman in this country who hasn't had some type of unwanted verbal accosting, some type of, you know, what we'd call more on the, if you want, I hate to use milder because I don't want to justify it or minimize it, but kind of the milder spectrum, right, of what we would consider unwanted sexual attention and sexual, aggression. Mm-hmm. We see it in our jokes. We see it in our TV. We see it in our music. We see it in our advertising. We see it in our laws, you know, and the idea is that a lot of the focus, and even in how some of what you're asking for tonight, is how do I protect myself? And so then all the onus is on, well, don't get raped. That's where all of the information, right? Like, these are the ways that you can protect yourself. And I'm not saying, I mean, all of us should know something about self-defense. All of us should, you know, be somewhat aware of the surroundings. But why do we have like 90% of the messages focused on victims, right? And like how to make sure you don't get raped, instead of having so much educational systems or things in place as far as how do you not rape? How do you not rape? You know, and actually there's some programs actually coming out of certain parts of Africa. I would have to look it up to understand which country in Africa, but they're actually doing quite a bit of education with their young men and seeing amazing results, you know, as far as that type of education. Don't rape, don't be a sexual assaulter, don't do the things that would be considered non-consensual or that would be, you know, that you think are funny or silly or mild, and they're actually sexually violent or aggressive things to do. And I also want to, you know, just kind of say, a lot of times we talk in very gendered ways about this, but the reality is that almost 99% of rape and sexual assault is conducted by males. Now, males are sexually traumatized, and many males are victims of sexual trauma, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And we do have female perpetrators, so I'm not trying to completely erase those, but when we're talking about this issue in general, we're talking about the culture has given this message to men that there's something permissible about sexual aggression. And it's also given that message to women, who then become gatekeepers of sexual aggression. All right, I thought too that I would just give a few examples so that we can see how this shows up in our day-to-day culture. Because again, if you're thinking, oh, rape, that equals dark alley, stranger, we really need to reconceptualize that. So sexual harassment is a big one, which includes sexually permissive jokes. You might think they're funny. I'm guessing a lot of women in your life will ha 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 about it, because that's what we've been taught to do. We've been taught that in that moment of discomfort, even if it's a sexual joke that we don't appreciate, in the moment, don't make a big deal, don't draw attention to yourself, go with the flow, don't make him feel bad, right? You don't want him to have any discomfort.
No.
So just, laugh along, be friendly, be kind, right? These are all messages that, again, I know I'm sweeping with wide brushes, but in general, women get those messages more than men in our country. Again, we tend to look at, and even just this whole experience with Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford, what do we look at? When we hear a story of sexual assault or an allegation, we tend to look at the victim's attire, their mental state, their motives, and their history. And any one of those things can completely discredit a sexual assault victim's story, right? And so when you look at somebody like, for example, and I wrote about this, I'm sure on Facebook, but Dr. Ford, she's fairly privileged. White, she's well educated. She presents herself as somewhat mentally stable, as far as I could tell. Yeah. She doesn't have like a huge history of criminality or, right, things of that nature. And even with all of those boxes checked, we still have, what's her real motive? Does she even know what she's talking about? Sure, she can remember some of it, but can she remember all of it? Does, so we're calling her mental state into question, even though she's got a PhD. So you can start to see how we break down a victim's credibility incredibly quickly. And we don't tend to do that so much with the perpetrator. And even though the perpetrator in this particular occasion, in this case, has a lot of questionable, he has a history of drinking, he has a history of partying, he has a history of kind of, saying inappropriate sexual things in his yearbook page or things of that nature. Oh, we can kind of dismiss a lot of that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Unless it's super, super blatant, we're not going to necessarily do that same credibility check on both sides of the aisle. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
Again, defining manhood, the pressure to score, the pressure to be sexual. Again, I think this is very harmful to young teenage boys, how we raise them in this kind of, you're supposed to be sexual, you're supposed to want it, you're supposed to, I don't think we teach boys consent of their own accord, much less how to offer it to another person, right? And so I think that we have a lot of issues with that. I think, again, how we define womanhood, and that's mostly sexually passive or submissive, or, kind of some of these things of, if you put out, or if you're sexual and of your own accord, that somehow that means you're promiscuous or loose or things of that nature. Just some things that have been just in the last 5 years that I've heard politicians, talk about, that certain girls allow themselves to get raped. That's been out there. It's very common to see, even in journalism, the word sex inserted instead of rape. So conflating sexuality with rape. Politicians distinguishing between legitimate rape and non-legitimate rape. That's extremely distressing. Victims being told that they're overreacting. Parents, lots of parents are currently blaming over-sexualized girls for how they present themselves on social media, and that they're worried that this is going to lead their sons into sin, instead of focusing on male responsibility for sexual input that's coming in and how they can completely manage themselves regardless of what type of stimuli is in the arena. Boys are not like weird creatures that have no control, but somehow we treat them like that.
We do.
So I could go on and on with the sentencing issues in this country, as far as how much, first of all, about 3 cases in 1,000 actually see any level of prosecution, and the prosecution terms and the times that people go to jail, and sometimes, especially if it's a prominent member in society, there's probation instead of jail time. I mean, it's really incredible the types of things that are happening in regards to, does the time fit the crime, right? So that's a huge issue in of itself. We assume that false reporting is a bigger issue than it is, and that's been all over the media, which is so distressing to me, because all that does is keep people from wanting to report.
Yeah.
Calling victims career destroyers. Let's see.
I've heard that over and over these last few days.
Yeah, considerations women make about their whereabouts on a daily basis versus men. I don't know about you, but if it's late at night, even in a parking lot, if I'm even going into a parking garage, I'm nervous. I'm looking over my shoulder. I'm concerned. I'm worried, just from, either for sexual assault or just, assault in general. Like, those are things that I'm not sure men necessarily experience that in the same way that women experience it, especially in different places. I mean, I'm guessing there are places that anybody would feel scared, but I'm also assuming that, there are many general places men might not consider fear where I would. Let's see. Teaching women not to get raped instead of teaching men not to rape, and assuming that men don't get raped or only weak men get raped. So, there's a whole nother consideration there. So that's my best attempt at explaining rape culture and why it's so prevalent, and why it doesn't mean that that everybody's rapist, but we are all in many ways complicit in rape culture. How we teach our children, how we navigate the world, how we allow other people to navigate the world. It's hard to change culture, right? It's something that happens kind of at a subconscious level. So the only way we can change it is self-awareness and educating ourselves, and then trying in our little corners of the world to make a difference. And that's hard, especially when, like, in times like these, you feel like, what's the point? You feel attacked, or you feel like I'm taking a huge risk in my own vulnerability by trying to change some of this. So anyway, any thoughts from you as far as just my information so far?
Yeah. So, in fact, I've talked to a few people over the last few days. One thing that came up was, what happened till innocent till proven guilty? When it came to the idea that just speaking of Miss Ford, and just her or anybody bringing up that the fact that somebody might have raped them or done something that crossed the line, and then the reaction is, well, what happened to innocent till proven guilty? And as you were talking about, getting out of your car, going in, and I even said to someone today, this isn't a court of law where we're deciding guilt and innocence always. Sometimes we're deciding character. And I said, when you go in a store and there's some guy lurking at your car, you're going to sit there and decide whether or not he's a man of character that you trust to go out to your car or not. And you're going to judge that person. And you're not in a court of law, and he's not going to prison based upon what you're judging. And yet you still have a right to judge that person's character. So we look at someone like Kavanaugh, and everybody's all up in arms. You can't judge him because we have no proof. So there's this whole thing about having no proof. And yet women have to be able to act on evidence. And I think we have that taken away from us time and time again with this whole thing of, where's your proof? And so I think that, okay, I may not have proof, and women almost never have proof unless they actually, are able to go do a rape kit and all of that. And how often does that happen? And yet we often have evidence. And a lot of times evidence, you can't put somebody in prison for that, but you can make decisions based upon that, in my opinion. The other thing is that you brought up was people feeling like they are, so we're talking about rape culture and it being largely women. Just from my perspective and the attacks that were put upon me, and as I listen to you, I think women really have few avenues to traverse, really. And I'm taking a little different than what you said, but from once they've been assaulted in some way, because if they don't have this proof, or like when I was, mine started when I was 11 years old, so I had no even reason to know that I needed proof, and then when I did finally tell, because at that age you get told, if you tell, something bad's going to happen to you, and you believe it when you're little. Or if you don't tell, I'll do something good for you. When in my case, I had both of those happening at the same time. And so when I did tell, I got various responses. One being, well, that's terrible. Let's take you to, let's call the bishop. So, and then you go to the bishop and he's basically downplaying it and saying, well, you just need to try harder, and that whole story.
You grew up in what type of congregation did you grow up in? What religion?
I was Mormon. My family was Mormon way back. And the difference for me is my mom was kind of like the black sheep of her family. She didn't go to church. So I wasn't raised like a lot of people. My dad and my mom were not active, but the entire extenuating family was very active. So they took it upon themselves to constantly try to get me and my two sisters involved in church constantly. So I was taken to church a lot by my relatives, enough to understand be involved.
Right.
So,
and these messages, many of these messages kind of run rampant in religious communities, which I think again is why it's so hard for people to own it, because you think of yourself as religious, you think of your religious community as good, in general, like we're good people, we're going to church, we're church goers, right? We the last thing we want is for people to be harmed or to be hurt. So we don't have any rape culture here, that's so offensive, right? And again, I'm really just inviting people to really sit with that feeling if you have it, and really kind of get more to a place where it's like, this stuff is subconscious. It's not like intention. Rape culture isn't about waking up in the morning, I can't wait to go hurt somebody. Rape culture is a subconscious reality that we're all living in. It's kind of like a fish in water. You can't really tell what water is because you live in it, right? It's very hard to kind of become aware of these things. But some very typical things that happen in religious cultures are the forgiveness rhetoric, just so a lot of people aren't held accountable. A lot of people go to ecclesiastical leaders to report instead of authorities to report. Many ecclesiastical leaders in many different types of churches don't, or at least historically didn't know how to deal with that very well. We've gotten better as a culture in that. Unfortunately, Mormonism in particular is lagging in that area. We have A lot of the gender roles, like, you know, boys will be boys in church settings and girls are kind of the pure virginal, you know, I don't know, conduits of sexual purity, you know, and so you have a lot of that. Again, so if a girl steps out of that sexual virginal role and wears, you know, something that shows a little leg or a little cleavage, immediately she's kind of, you know, horrified, right? I like to make up a lot of these words that I say, but you know, she's turned into kind of this horror picture, which is kind of a horrible word in general, and it's very biblical and it's used a lot in religious settings, you know, so a lot of these messages that you're hearing from preachers or different religious leaders are very sexualized in gender ways. Just kind of, there's a lot of that in kind of puritanical Christian, Mormon, Catholic, a lot of these religions where you get that rape culture as well.
Yeah,
All
exactly.
right, well, we're at the point where I'm going to cut off the Facebook Live feed. So usually how Sex Talk with Natasha goes is about half the program is on Facebook Live. The rest of it is for subscribers to take advantage of. So just to let you know where I'm headed, I have 7 tips for people to, for women in particular, or those who feel that they're affected by rape culture, because again, we haven't even mentioned the LGBT community and how, you know, it's very, very prominent in that, especially transgender individuals who are high risk for sexual violence. Anyway, if you feel like you're affected by rape culture, I've got 7 tips that hopefully can help. And I'm going to invite you, Diamond, to add maybe your own ideas about how you have survived, or how do you manage, you know, since it's not something that's going away tomorrow, how do we continually manage something that's difficult and that's there and that's oppressive? How do you live in kind of an oppressive space that can be kind of taxing, chronically taxing? So I have some tips about that. And then if there are any questions that I am able to read, I'll make sure and cover those as well. So that's where we're headed. If you're interested in subscribing, just go to sextalkwithnatasha.com. There's a very easy button that says subscribe. You can also look me up on patreon.com, Sex Talk with Natasha. You can also subscribe directly there. So either way. And thank you for joining us if you've done that so far.